Rabbit Golf Club in Philadelphia, Mississippi.
Good morning. Welcome in. The Out of Bounds Show is driven by the great selection of SUVs and trucks. They're loaded up at the dealership at Mack Hike in Flowood, mackhikeflowood.com. Tell them you heard about us on the Out of Bounds Show. mackhikeflowood.com. We welcome in Steve Robertson, genespage.com, the Boneyard Podcast, talking MSU recruiting. So, Steve, MSU football has had some signing days where things didn't go their way. Yesterday, well, just about everything went their way with Percy Lewis, with Trevion Williams, with Jacarius Clayton, DeCarlos Nicholson, and the list goes on and on. What happened? Why were they so successful yesterday?
Well, I think the first thing you've got to do is, really tip your cap to the Mississippi State coaching staff for their efforts during the contact period. And there were a lot of highly contested recruiting battles out there. They were able to win those. And, they really, I think, met their needs. But this is really just a start to the season. I mean, State's still got to go out there and work the transfer portal and, find some plug-and-play guys that can come in and make them a better football team in 2022, and especially at safety. You got to go out and get a couple of, maybe two safeties out of the portal if you can get two quality guys. That was a position this year that was better than it was a year ago, but not quite where it needed to be, I think, in order for State to take the next step. But the reality of it is you're right, Bo, there were a lot of signing days in the past where no matter how well things went, there was always a wet blanket to dampen the Bulldog enthusiasm. But yesterday, things went almost to script, just about a best-case scenario.
All right. We've been told starting last weekend that Trevion Williams dominated at Mississippi All-Star practices. Not just one, but all four. And that many people believe he's the best player in the state of Mississippi. And I made I said that if he played at Madison Central, Brandon, even MRA Prep, Starkville, Meridian, he'd have a higher rating. You agree? You disagree? What did you hear on the practices, and what do you think about Trevion Williams?
Well, the first thing I would say is I'm a huge Branson Robinson fan, and I still would have him number one. I do think you can absolutely make the argument that Trevion Williams is a top defensive prospect in the state of Mississippi, and I think he showed that. I mean, I think this year he had a really good senior year, and then, at the All-Star practices, I mean, like you mentioned, all the reports that we had is that he was the guy. He was the bell cow of that defense, and practiced and played, exceptionally well. And this is one that's been trending Mississippi State's way for a long time. And the reality of it is, I was told really back at the Kentucky game when he and his family, his mom, his grandmother, his aunt came up for the Kentucky game, that was it, that his mind was made up at that point that he wanted to be a Mississippi State Bulldog. And really his actions down the stretch really kind of echoed that sentiment. I know that Ole Miss tried desperately to get him on campus for an official visit. He never took the trip. And speaking to some of their media people, they just never found any traction with him down the stretch. And Mississippi State ultimately gets him. And that was one of the highlights of yesterday's activities. The Bulldogs add, some really quality players in addition to what they had currently committed.
Steve Robertson on the Out of Bounds Show. Steve, Percy Lewis, when will he enroll for the number one offensive tackle out of JUCO? Will he enroll for MSU in January or June 1?
Yeah, he's a January guy, and that's really big for State. You're losing both tackles, and so you have to have somebody come in and compete. Now, he's got to get in football shape, and he did trim up a little bit this year, but he'll have the benefit of spring practice and then all the summer workouts, and probably we'll see him drop about 25 pounds, I suspect, between now and then. And he's one of these big country strong kids, that it's just kind of a bully on the field. But his best football is really ahead of him, and that's a huge get for State. I would submit to you, Percy Lewis, perhaps the most important offensive recruit in this class for Mississippi State due to needs at the position.
How much more before I get into that, let's go to Avery Sledge, who was a Tulane commit, and Mississippi State started recruiting, I guess maybe heavily, more so the last few weeks. And he's a big kid. He can put on a lot of weight. How do you project Avery Sledge out of Brooklyn, Mississippi?
Well, he's been on the Mississippi State recruiting radar for several months, actually, and he was a guy they monitored throughout the year. And listen, he played on a bad football team, and that's not to cast any aspersions at anybody. I mean, they just didn't have a good – they were a very young team this year. So he played quarterback and linebacker. And he is a guy that's very athletic and got great length. He's a guy that can cover in space, and I think his best football is ahead of him. And I really love this linebacker class. And to be honest with you, I think at this point – it is the strength of the class. It's kind of reminiscent in some respects to a few years ago when State signed Jett Johnson, Nathaniel Watson, and Aaron Brule in one class. But about those guys, Jett was the only true backer. I mean, Nathaniel Watson was a converted wide receiver. Aaron Brule is a former safety that bulked up and slid down in the box. Well, all three of these guys are linebackers by trade. I mean, Javay Gilmore, of course, is an outstanding player. You begin to kind of run through the options there, and you realize – this is a group that can really play. This is a group, Khalid Moore, another standout at the Mississippi-Alabama All-Star practices and game. And you can get really excited because I think when you look at the great Mississippi State defenses, it's always really been about those linebackers. There's always that one guy that's kind of the face of the defense. I think you went out and improved that personnel group immensely, and I think Sledge is a big part of that. And he almost gets lost in the shuffle yesterday because you do add to Carlos Nicholson. You do get Trevion Williams and Percy Sledge. But the guys like Calvin Dinkins and Avery Sledge, that's what Mississippi State has built a football program on. These small-town guys that maybe are a little bit underdeveloped in high school that really thrive on the college level, and I think Sledge certainly fits that bill.
You mentioned DeCarlos Nicholson. That was a battle between Kentucky and other schools. What do you think about him? Do you think he's really capable of coming in and playing day one?
Yeah, I do, but I think the spring is incredibly important to him. He was a guy that was a quarterback by trade and really made the move to the defensive backfield this year. And so there was still some growing pains with that. But, 6'3", 200 pounds, he's a huge, long corner that can really run. And so I do expect him to be in the two deep this year. And if he starts, will kind of depend on how things go in spring practice. But this is a guy, too, that previous Mississippi State commitment, he opened it back up. His recruitment exploded. Auburn was involved. Florida State was involved. And, of course, Kentucky and Ole Miss. But in the end, it boiled down to State and Kentucky. And I think in the end, Bo, that, it's one thing to commit to Kentucky when you got 6 months to figure it out. But now all of a sudden you think, man, I'm 2 weeks away from having to move to Lexington, Kentucky and live in all that cold weather and be far away from my friends and family. And I think ultimately geography played a big factor in things, as well as Mississippi State's needs at corner.
Just a couple of weeks ago, people were thinking that the staff wasn't going to be able to put together a good class, MSU staff. I even had some strong comments a couple of weeks ago. Are you surprised at their production level or how savvy they are maybe now when it comes to SEC recruiting?
Well, I think they're certainly getting there, and I think that's part of the thing too. Is I didn't feel the sense of panic that many other people did. I mean, when Jaheim Otis no-showed Mississippi State and went to Ole Miss, there were a lot of Mississippi State folks who said, "Well, here it is. Here's that patented annual collapse and limp towards signing day." But there were so many pieces still available. There were so many prospects that were still in the discussion with Mississippi State. I just never thought that maybe we'd get into yesterday and they would get all of them. Trent Ramsey, the offensive lineman out of Tampa, that's really the only really disappointment yesterday. And we kind of got word on signing day eve that he was trending towards Cal. And so he leaves, but Mississippi State gets everybody else.
All right, real quick, how many transfers do you think Leach and the crew would like to bring in, ideally?
Well, I think you'd like to get an offensive tackle. I think maybe you get a receiver or two. Then you get a corner and possibly two safeties. And that's kind of where we are with college football now. You got to go mine that portal and find some guys. And here's the thing, Bo. At the end of the day, I think it's important for State to hit those needs, but you got to get guys that can play. You don't have to have warm bodies.
Yeah. Steve Robertson. Thanks, Steve. Steve Robertson, genespage.com, 247 Sports. On the Bell's Two-Hearted Ale guest line. You're listening to Out of Bounds, 105.9 The Zone, ESPN. And we are brought to you by Corner Market Grocery Store, the official grocery store of the Out of Bounds show. Corner Market Grocery Store.